This policy here is the first steps to a UBI. A UBI is an unconditional basic income. I use the term unconditional to mean that the conditions on it are either zero or quite wide, so not very tight. It tends to be known as a universal basic income because everybody gets it, and we will eventually get to universality. But I can tell you right now, it's a long road to universality, simply because we're starting with such a huge, overbearing, targeted regime. So we have to unpick it in order to travel to the true universality. And part of that unpicking is restoring integrity to the tax system, which is what Policy 1 does. Policy 1 makes sure that every form of income gets taxed, not just a few. And that's why we've got the tax on capital, or minimum tax. If you're already making sufficient return from your capital, then Policy 1 doesn't affect you actually at all. It's just picking up that capital that gives tax-free income, which is what we all specialise in buying. Okay, so as outlined in the book that we did on this, Big Kahuna, back in 2011, a UBI empowers people because it gives you more choices. This income comes in day after day, no matter. Think of it like New Zealand super for youngies, right? That's the way to think about it. It also goes to every adult, so it recognises the contribution of the million people in this society of ours that work but don't get paid. Okay, so they're the people that bring up the little people, the people that look after the elders, and of course a lot of elders themselves who do voluntary work in the community. One of the stigmatisations I think that we have in society is that if you're not in the paid workforce, you're almost invisible, regarded as a non-person. And I don't think that that's very conducive to building strong communities. Another reason for it is that with this increasing technological revolution and globalisation, which we don't expect to be wound back, there's increasing casualisation of work. So, you know, you work today, you don't work tomorrow. You know what I mean? When that first started to descend on New Zealand, we used to call ourselves consultants. It's got quite a nice ring to it, consultant. Well, there's lots of more consultants now, so it's a way to put a bit of a cushion under there to help fund retraining, help between jobs, whatever, just give you more independence in your lives. And because the testing of these benefit tends to be so wide, if not zero, then of course it removes the poverty traps of high effective marginal tax rates. As you come off a benefit into work at the moment, the benefit abates, and sometimes those abatement rates can be unbelievably high. Working for families, for example, still got some abatement rates up around the 100%. So over a certain range, every dollar you earn, you lose $1, which you know is called a poverty trap. So it tends to mitigate or get rid of those disincentives to work and wind back that dehumanisation and stigmatisation that has now become so prevalent with tightly targeted social benefits, which does a lot of damage actually to people who are already under stress because of lack of work or low incomes or high rents or a combination. The major constraint on a UBI, there's two. There's fiscally, our ability to pay for a UBI from the tax pool. For example, the only UBI we have at the moment is New Zealand Super. There's absolutely no hope in hell of that ever being extended to everybody. It's way, way too burdensome fiscally. It's gold-plated, that thing. And the other is you don't want the UBI to undermine the incentive to do paid work. So it can't be set up at the minimum wage or anywhere near that really, because otherwise you undermine the whole productive base of your economy. Well, not the whole, the paid work part of your productive. So those two constraints tend to, when you do the arithmetic on this, tend to box you in terms of, just how generous or modest, the range for a UBI has to be. It's unlikely when you do the arithmetic on the UBI that it will ever replace all of the targeted benefits. But what we can do is we can wind them back and down and out some of them and get rid of the worst, the most dehumanising of them first, which is what we want to do. Okay, so here's the policy. So the first two groups to enter into the UBI regime will be, firstly, those families who have very young children. So these are children under 3, or in the case of foster kids and adopted kids, under 6. And we are setting that at $10,000 a year for those families, replaces paid parental leave. It's all year. Now, that's based on the evidence that the families under most stress are the families with the youngest of the children. That's the time when things go awry. And when you get these kiddies turning up in the schooling system at age 5 and they're already 2 years behind, they never make it up. So they become, not only are their lives sacrificed in a way, but they also become a very high cost on society. You'll find a lot of our policy is about prevention rather than the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. So it tends to be bigger picture, longer term investment type stuff, as opposed to just, having to react to today's crisis. And this is very much in that mode. So those families with children under 3 get the UBI. All families. Not income tested, everybody. The second group is the elders, all those citizens over 65, which is the current age of superannuation. Now they get, under this first step, a UBI that's twice that of the young family. So they get $10,000 each. Just thought I'd introduce it that way so you can understand how generous we are. Now, of course, that's not the same level as the current level of New Zealand superannuation, which is 17 if you're 17.5 or something if you're single, and a couple, and 20 if you're single. So the balance is available, but subject to a means test. Now the thing with that revision of New Zealand Super is we can implement it tomorrow. It doesn't need to be started in 2040 when I'm 76. Mr. English. One of the problems we seem to be getting with establishment parties is they announce parties that aren't policies that aren't policies. They announce them to be introduced at some future date when they're no longer with us. I hope you've twigged to that by now. It's very popular. The other thing that we would do with the elders UBIs, we would index it to the CPI for elders, not to wages. And that is why Winston Peters is always so wrong when he says, well, all we need to do is grow the GDP and the load of the National Super will go down. National Super is indexed to GDP. By far the bulk of GDP is wages and incomes. And it's indexed to it. It's impossible for it to go down. But, keeps Winston happy. Okay. So it's a substantial top-up for those young families. Boosts their ability to nurture their children through those most vulnerable years. And as I say, it starts to honour, it just starts the process of honouring the unpaid work that those people do. In addition to those two first tentative steps down the road to UBI, we want to do a couple of things for low-income families now. So those are families with children under 17. So in addition for them, another $72 a week, $3,744 a year, instead of the in-work tax credit. The difference here is it is the in-work tax credit, right? But the difference with us is no test on the hours. So at the moment you do 20 hours or 30 hours for a couple to get that. We're saying no. If you've got kids and you're trying to juggle work as well, as long as you've got evidence of paid work, then you get that top up. You see what we're doing? We're pulling back from this incredibly tight eligibility criteria that's causing all hell to break loose at the boundary. In terms of people's behaviour, trying to rort the system, the additional stress. Oh, I only did 19 hours, so you won't get it for another 2 months as punishment. That sort of crap. Right, just trying to take that away out of the system. Those people obviously still remain eligible for their normal current welfare payments, whether it's unemployment, disability, sole parent, so on, or if they're just lowly paid anyway. And a second of the additional measures for low-income families is that to get free, full-time childcare for the children between 1 and 3. We've already announced free early childhood education, full-time, high quality, same quality for everybody, available for 3 and 4-year-olds. So this is looking after the 1 to 3s. So it's childcare. That 3 to 4 early education initiative is not compulsory, but it's there. So it means that when you've got a family on low incomes and mum and dad are doing 2, 3, 4, whatever it is, jobs, the children don't suffer by being in very poor early childhood education, which we have too much of. So it's going to require obviously an investment and more teachers at that level. These changes will all be, when you take the whole lot together, fiscally neutral. Everything I do is fiscally neutral. We're going to have a conversation about raising the level of tax. That's a very different conversation to have. So I don't really want to have that during this election campaign, because it will distract us from what I think are long overdue fundamental reforms to our economic and social policy. So this is fiscally neutral. What that means in English, it costs about $3 billion, those measures, but we get the $3 billion from pulling back New Zealand superannuation. So it's a transfer from my generation to investing in future generations. Next year, Joanne and I qualify for $40,000 New Zealand super. I don't need a cent of it. What the hell are you doing giving it to me? We'll just buy motorcycles. Now with this reduced, we'll be able to get 1 motorcycle, so Joanne be happy, and I guess I'll get a Vespa. So, I'm hardly punished. So that's the first part of this package. First steps towards a UBI. That's how we do it, and it's fiscally neutral. The second part of the package is we've called decent housing for decent people. Now how that works is it sort of dovetails with Policy 1. But Policy 1 was the one where we want to take out the escalation in house prices and just hold house prices and give incomes time to catch up. But ultimately what we want to see is the price of housing reflecting the demand for accommodation, nothing else. Not the demand by me to make money from housing. I own 6 houses. I don't have tenants, they just make the carpets dirty. I own them because I know you're going to bid the price up. and I've known it since 1984. It's a one-way ticket to making money. Have a look at New Zealand's rich list as to where most of the money is made. Surely you can see now something is wrong. The affordability of housing is absolutely ridiculous in this country. And all it is a wealth transfer from those without property to those with. It is incredibly damaging to the economy and to society. It's denying businesses the capital it needs to invest in R&D and expansion, employment, wages and profits. Because all we're doing is every time we get a bit of surplus, we go buy another house, and of course we leverage it through, I'll just have a drink here, through our borrowings from the bank, which are primarily foreign debt. So we have a debt on the other side of the balance sheet to match basically the value of housing. Our savings rate, so-called, is unbelievably low by OECD average. So, you know, that's our fundamental imbalance that Policy 1 is dealing to. Now, one of the issues of the unaffordability of housing, of course, is the stress on people who are tenants. It's enormous. So what you're seeing in New Zealand for the last 10, 15 years is you've seen middle incomes, middle to lower incomes, not growing much at all, growing a little. But once you take out the accommodation costs, down they've gone. So they're getting hit as well. It's not just the people who are aspiring to buy a house. The tenants are really feeling it in terms of cash flow. So decent housing for decent people is about to address the conundrum that the tenants face. And what we want to do here is accept that generation rent is here to stay. It won't be generation rent, by the way, it'll be generations rent. But lifelong rentals will become a feature now of the New Zealand housing market because the cost of housing is so high and it's just going to take us so long to get it back. So what we want to do is adopt the German model of tenancy law. Some of you might be familiar with it, but it's also practiced in Holland and Switzerland, but the Germans seem to have got it right. This is how it works. It's all about identifying housing as a social good and ensuring that tenants have security of tenure. So it restricts, under tenancy law, the conditions under which a landlord can evict a tenant. And it essentially restricts them to non-payment of rent or damage to the property. Apart from that, the landlord has quite a job evicting a tenant. So changing the ownership of the property is not a reason to evict a tenant. Germany, by the way, has 60% of its people housed in rental housing, and 90% of the rental of all housing is owned by the private sector. It's not the Netherlands are different, but it's not a model that's overburdened with social housing and, you know, state-owned housing. It's not that at all. It's a private sector model. All they've done is change the law to make sure that private profit maximisation is harmonious with the social good and the social stability of families. The tenant, on the other hand, can give 90 days notice. So you can see how it's loaded. So of course their average tenancy period is a lot longer than the 15 months that is the New Zealand average. There are exceptions to the rule around precincts, say around universities, where there's clearly identified a short-term rental market. That's different. But the stock standard lease you have to opt out of is one where essentially it rolls on and the landlord has to have very special circumstances to evict a tenant. So change of ownership isn't necessarily one, it can be one. You can get it for that, especially, or the other one is you can get it for as if you're moving in yourself, but you can't make a habit of it. Okay. A warrant of fitness would be required for all residential rental properties to ensure sanitation, warmth and energy efficiency standards. So the rents, let's just talk about the German thing for a moment, because the rents there are market rents. So how they do it though is this. Any new tenancies, the rent you settle is whatever the market will bear. So then they run for each area an index of the new tenancies, and they work out how much the new rents are compared to the old rents. So say they're up 10%. Then they say, right, now existing rents, you all have to go up 10%, but it's over 3 years, not over the 1 year that we've measured it. So you see what they're doing? They just slow it down so that the tenants have an ability to adjust. So the market still rules, but with what they call a price break on it. So it's still market determined rents. So of course what you find in those countries is that investing in rental housing sector is a very big sector. As I said, 60% of people are in it, and it's a private sector and it makes money. But it's not making money out of the appreciation of the housing, it's making money out of the rental yields of the housing. So it's a cultural change, a wee bit like I used to describe containing your cat. We won't go there. Okay, so in conclusion, what we're doing with the seventh policy really is we're trying to correct two of the biggest mistakes that have been made by leaders in New Zealand. One was by Sir Robert Muldoon in 1975 with the most powerful election bribe ever, New Zealand superannuation. 42 years later, we still are trying to adjust to this thing, and all you're seeing from the establishment parties is, well, how far and how far should we move the age out? It's a pretty silly way of dealing with the problem. There are people of 65 years old who have had very physical jobs or lives who actually are at the end. They are in the knackers yard. So they do need it now. So, keep pushing it out till you're 95 if you like, but it's not really serving its purpose, which is to just put a safety net under the elderly folks. And the other correction we're making is to Roger Douglas, actually, who, when he liberalised markets, which was fine, he took all the taxation around accumulated wealth away. And it's still away today, and that's a disaster, because what we're doing is we're investing where the biggest tax break is, as opposed to where the biggest economic return is. So that's the end of this seventh policy of ours, the UBI, thriving families and dealing with rents.